Work time reduction is very much something that we see as a productivity initiative. And that might seem really counterintuitive for people. We're saying to people that you can spend less time at work in a given week, and that's going to help us solve our productivity problem. You cannot beat burnout off the side of an overflowing desk. And so what work time reduction does is it forces you to address those root causes. Things like unclear expectations in your role, unclear boundaries between work and life, unsustainable workloads and poor resource management. It forces organizations to deal with these issues head on. 15% of people were saying that no amount of money would persuade them to go back to working 5 days, having experienced the benefits of working a 4-day work week. So I think the value of this is something that is clearly very powerful to employees.
What if the key to better productivity isn't working harder, but working less? Could shorter work weeks and reduced hours transform not just our output, but our well-being? And how can HR professionals and leaders spearhead this shift towards a more sustainable work practice? Hey, I'm Tim, and welcome to Future Work, the podcast for HR professionals navigating the fast-evolving world of work. Each episode brings fresh perspectives and actionable insights to lead today and build for tomorrow. Today, I'm joined by Joe O'Connor from Work Time Reduction, a consultancy redefining how we approach overwork and productivity. In this episode, Joe shares the surprising benefits of shorter work weeks and the strategies organizations can adapt to address root cause of burnout and inefficiency. If you're looking to create a more engaged, balanced, and productive workforce, this is a conversation for you. Have a listen.
This episode of Future Work is brought to you by Tactic. Does your hybrid office feel like chaos? Who's in the office? Where are they sitting? What meeting rooms are available? Luckily, I have a solution for you. Tactic is the #1 rated space logistics platform used by customers like Microsoft, Redbull, the United Nations, and Northwestern University to create order out of chaos. Tactic has a 100% customer satisfaction score on G2 because it was built from the ground up with the end user in mind. It's an all-in-one solution for hot desking, room reservations, and visitor management. Visit gettactic.com/work and start your free trial today. Thanks so much to the Tactic team for sponsoring this episode. And now onto the podcast.
Well, Joe, I'm grateful that you have joined me today on the FlexOS, the Future of Work podcast, specifically for HR. But this conversation is broader than HR, which I'm equally as excited about. We're going to be talking about work and time spent on work. But before we get into it, because I could just jump right in, Joe, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are.
Sure. Pleasure to join you, Tim. Looking forward to the conversation. I run a consulting organization called Work Time Reduction. We specialize in shorter workweek models and also in helping organizations and teams to alleviate overwork. So really a lot of what we do is trying to find ways to work less and achieve more. I started doing this really off the back of leading a lot of the global pilots and trials of a 4-day working week between 2020 and 2022. So yeah, excited for the conversation.
And your organization and FlexOS have partnered together on creating a report specifically around work time reduction. And that push to work fewer hours, that concept of work-life balance, I still don't know what that means or how this had exist, and just taking a data-driven look at this idea of work time reduction. Before we even get into the report, let's talk about this idea, this concept of work time reduction. And I think many of our listeners would be familiar with the idea of a 4-day work week. Before we hit record, we talked about the hype of 4-day work weeks, specifically around COVID or even just before COVID. And there's a lot of buzz around 4-day work time reduction. What does it mean and how does it differ from a 4-day work week?
So a 4-day work week is one component within what we see as a broader spectrum of work time reduction. And so I would say the 4-day 32-hour work week is very much the gold standard that we have worked with many organizations to adopt, which I think if you're looking for something that can give your talent proposition a real significant differentiator in the market, that can give you a really significant competitive edge when it comes to attracting and retaining the best people, That's something that a 4-day work week can deliver. And I think that there are much more organizations across many more industries than maybe people would initially believe can do that. And we're really seeing that in the market. But the reality is that that isn't going to work for every organization right away. We're not going to go into a law firm where people are working 55, 60 hours a week, very much experiencing a lot of burnout, unsustainable workloads, unhealthy lifestyle as a result of their work habits, and say, hey, you need to do a 4-day work week. And so we see work time reduction as being something which, it can help organizations to combat overwork, to maybe turn a 10 or 11 hour day into a more standard 8 or 9 hour day, to get home in time to have dinner with your kids. And then there's lots of variations in between. We've seen organizations do things like 9-day fortnights where you've got a 4-day work week every second week, half-day Fridays, maybe slightly shorter work days. So this is something that we very much believe is not one size fits all, but the core principles of the fact that we have the technology and we have the productive capacity to spend less time at work while still delivering the same or even more, we believe that that applies across the board.
I like the idea of spending less time at work, not just from the perspective of, hey, I want to spend time with my wife and my kids. I think that's an added bonus, but also from that idea of being able to set that clear boundaries. And I think that's something I know for me and many of my friends, we struggle with setting those boundaries. And so this idea of like work time reduction, we're kind of jumping ahead here, but I'm really curious about that. What have you seen even from that 4-day work week model about setting those clear boundaries? I think we're kind of jumping to the conclusion, and don't worry, we're going to get to the data piece, but that's something that's just always been top of mind for me.
I think the first thing that it's really important for people to understand is, work time reduction is very much something that we see as a productivity initiative. And that might seem really counterintuitive for people. We're saying to people that you can spend less time at work in a given week, and that's going to help us solve our productivity problem. But the reality is that most productivity initiatives in organizations today fail because they lack one critical ingredient for success, which is enthusiastic employee buy-in, engagement, and motivation. And we know, in fact, that in many organizations, we actually actively disincentivize people from finding ways to do their jobs more efficiently, because often the only reward that they get for finding new and novel ways to get more done in less time is for more things to be loaded onto their plate, more work, more tasks. And that's a broken incentive structure. So work time reduction is really about flipping that on its head and saying that in exchange for realizing productivity gains, we're going to share the benefit of that with the workforce in a really tangible, really life-changing way through work time reduction. And that's how we're seeing these organizations deliver these very powerful outcomes, because people are aligned, their interests are aligned, and they have a stake in the productivity initiative.
You definitely hit on something that's top of mind for me. And I'm looking at my notes here, is that enthusiastic buy-in and engagement, because I've worked in organizations, and one example from almost 20 plus years ago was I found a more efficient way of doing something. And I was told by my peers to not do it that way because they didn't want to take on more extra work. And it was a foreign concept to me. I just thought, well, if I can do this job in half the amount of time, why wouldn't I? It's still a bit of a strange concept to some where, I don't want to be more efficient because then I'll have to take on more. So if I'm having a bad day, but now I'm quote unquote more efficient, I'm now going to have more work, or I'm going to be overloaded or overburdened. And I think even in the report, the work time reduction, the study in this area, there's a couple factors that have come up. And that is, those working overtime, those last minute requests, the unclear goals, the demands from clients, and the list does go on. And I think there's some hesitation to even think about this of like, oh, we want to become more efficient, but what if? Or what happens when? Let's talk about these barriers, because I'm sure you've seen it, especially, from working on that 4-day work week model for a number of years. Let's talk about some of those barriers that you have seen and heard of.
The data is really clear that reduced work time and 4-day work weeks are positive for employee well-being. I don't think that will surprise too many people. that this is something that is delivering across all of the pilots, the research, the major studies that we've seen in recent years. We're seeing statistically significant improvements in employee well-being across a number of different indicators. I think part of the reason for that is obviously the additional rest, the additional recovery time, the additional kind of psychological detachment from work. But that's only part of the story. Other big component of that success is down to the work redesign that becomes necessary in order to adopt a work time reduction strategy or to implement a shorter work week. So, if you take Oxford University did a study last year where it looked at 90 different corporate well-being initiatives, things like yoga, meditation, sleep apps, and it found that only 1 out of the 90 had any demonstrably positive effect on employee well-being, and that was allowing people to volunteer for charity during the work week. And that's not to say that all of these things are not useful at an individual level, but the problem is they're not addressing root causes. You cannot beat burnout off the side of an overflowing desk. And so what work time reduction does is it forces you to address those root causes, things like unclear expectations in your role, unclear boundaries between work and life, unsustainable workloads and poor resource management. It forces organizations to deal with these issues head on, but to do so in a way where employees know that if they're successful in actually finding the efficiencies, that's something that's going to directly benefit them rather than just being subsumed and absorbed by the organization.
What you're saying coincides exactly with the study as well. Is the key hurdles for implementing are just that, right? It's that demanding workload, the demands of your clients, but also work culture. We're seeing a lot of mandate back to work right now, back to the office right now. And however, I think that the key is when we just think about the hurdles, and that's all we're focusing on, and not. I think the key word here is the root cause. What's causing that? And so I wonder if there's, maybe an HR professional, maybe somebody's listening to this and going, oh, I don't know how to get to the root cause. And I found this, my background is operations, and even just a rudimentary study of root cause analysis, getting to that, asking the 5 whys, figuring out that fishbone diet or whatever it is, we jump to solving symptoms rather than the actual root cause. What are your thoughts on that?
I totally agree. And I think that the critical thing with this approach is that you're giving employees permission to engage with what are the frustrations, what are the issues, but to do so in a way where, my job is so much easier than someone who's going into a team to implement a new piece of software, a piece of technology, because the incentive and the motivator is so great with a work time reduction conversation that the types of ideas that you get from the bottom up in terms of how to find those efficiencies is really quite incredible. A CEO that I worked with running a software company here in Toronto who moved to a 4-day work week a couple of years ago, he described how the 4-day work week didn't solve all of their problems. Actually, what it did was it surfaced all of their problems. It found all of the challenges within their systems, their processes, the bottlenecks. It brought those to the fore so that they could be addressed. And it provided this really incredible catalyst and forcing function for employees to engage with actually stopping and fixing those problems. I think that's really what differentiates work time reduction from, the flavor of the month operational excellence strategies like Lean or like Kaizen, which, often fall short because they don't answer the what's in it for me question in a way that really feels tangible for employees.
Yeah, the what's in it for me. And maybe a CEO, maybe somebody on an exec team, or even an HR leaders listening to this, and you're thinking, wow, our employees shouldn't have that mindset of what's in it for me. Well, reality is employees do have that mindset of, okay, what's in it for me though? We're asking to do this. We're reducing, or we want us to condense our work into 4 days or into 6 hours or whatever it is, maybe a half day Friday. Does that mean, there's some skepticism there. There's some skepticism of, okay, if we find these efficiencies, does that mean that we're just going to have to do more work? And so that's, I think, where the exec buy-in has to come into play.
Right. And when we look at organizations that have successfully made this transition, we know that we have a very significant problem in modern corporate culture with meeting bloat. We know that we have a major problem with digital distraction, interruptions, context switching and task switching, really impacting people's productivity. We know that we have, process issues that need to be addressed. So this is really about creating a framework and creating an incentive structure in order for these types of issues to be addressed. Things like, decision making within organizations. One of the most common problems that we see in organizations that, once solved, really helps with the transition to a reduced work time model is this idea that every decision gets defaulted up the line, gets escalated onto the desks of busy managers and onto the agendas of busy meetings. And actually, once you get really clear about what decisions is each individual employee and each team empowered to make, you create that kind of clarity that allows for much greater efficiency within the organization. So a lot of this, really is not rocket science. These are problems that we know exist. This is unlocked capacity that we know is there to be grabbed at. And all that we're doing in the course of these projects is we're providing something that really brings employees to the table in a way that, from a psychological perspective, there's three things here. There's the collective incentive. There's, what will really get people to engage with the organization's transformation goals, whatever that might be. There's the intrinsic individual motivation. And then there's the fact that as knowledge workers, I would argue that even in manufacturing today, much more of the role of a modern factory floor employee is about problem solving, decision making, is about coming up with new and creative ideas to actually improve process than was the case on the assembly line of 100 years ago. So we've got to an age now, and it's only going to increase with AI. Everyone is reliant on knowledge, brain power, and technology. And we know that a well-rested, well-recovered employee is going to be a more productive employee. And so this idea that we're not going to recognize the human constraints and limitations that lead to a diminishing rate of return on productivity, more mistakes, lower quality, higher risk of burnout and turnover, this is the reality that every leader needs to grapple with and deal with.
I've got so many different ideas or scenarios and from past work experiences that relate to that. Especially with a well-rested employee will perform better. We all have things that happen outside of work, and being able to provide that flexibility in order to maybe attend an appointment or go, to your kid's school play or, maybe care for a loved one. It all feeds into that overall, I think, commitment and engagement to that employer. But then there's also this question that we asked in the study, which is the top reasons employees work beyond their schedules. And we kind of alluded to it already, and often it's, depending on your jurisdiction where you live, it's not paid. It's just extra. So you get a salary. This concept of overtime almost seems to doesn't exist unless you're in a specific industry. That last minute request that comes in. Oh, I see you're putting your coat on, but I really need that report by the end of today. Or, hey, I know we don't have the resources, so I can't approve your vacation because there's nobody to backfill you. And there's so many of these, I guess, reasons we feel that leads to the burnout. And so, if I'm just putting on that pessimistic point of view, I'm like, oh, and now we want to look at reducing time. This puts a lot of onus on leaders and HR people, HR professionals, the people in culture teams to just sit back and go, we need to restructure how we're doing this. Because the data is also clear that if I think of reduced hours or condensed work week, I have more time for things like myself, my health. I can go to the gym and I'm not getting up at 4 a.m. or 5 a.m., whatever that looks like. Spending time with family, your hobbies. And so, I think the big question is where do we start? The data is clear. People are feeling those demands, the pressure already right now. Maybe there's some pessimistic view of like, now I have to do more with less. But then where do we start? How do we just surface those areas that we can improve?
So I think it starts with having that conversation, quite honestly. And I think if you take the example that you described of people who are in that situation where they're regularly overworking for those reasons, they are not going to thank you if leadership walk into a room and say, we're going to do experiment with a 4-day work week, because they have a pain point and a problem that needs to be resolved and addressed first. And so even just calling out the overwork problem, recognizing that this is something that not only is it not healthy and sustainable at an employee level, but recognizing that burnout, if you take most studies globally on burnout today, suggest somewhere between a third and 2/5 of the workforce are experiencing burnout in any given work year. I mean, that is an incredible crisis of epidemic proportions, but it's not just an individual wellness crisis, it's a corporate productivity crisis. If you look at the definition of burnout according to the WHO, it is somebody feeling cynical towards their work, it is someone feeling low confidence in their performance, and it's somebody who feels detachment from their work. All three of those symptoms combining at once. Nobody who's in that situation is going to be able to show up and perform at their best. And so recognizing that actually, if we can solve that, there's probably nothing more powerful we could do to make our organization more productive. And I think too many leaders still don't think about burnout in those terms. They still see that as this kind of wellness issue that sits somewhere else off to the side of our core focus and our core mission, when really it's quite fundamental.
I think one of the surprising pieces of data that I'm of hundreds of participants in this study, there's a significant amount of people that if their organization embraced work time reduction, removed the unnecessary, removed that noise, created clear goals. I mean, that's a whole other conversation. Maybe we'll dive into that here in a sec, but people are willing to give up, forego at least 1 year of salary increase just to have a shorter work week. When I read that, I actually had to read it a couple times because to me, that is significant. Just came across something on LinkedIn the day we were recording this, and I don't believe everything I read on LinkedIn, so I always read it with a grain of salt. But this person said they didn't accept a significant pay increase because they were afraid, and a new title, new job, because they were afraid of the demands it would then put on and strain on their family. And so I think leaders, HR people, we got to sit with that for a moment. We got to sit with that and talk to me about that. Have you seen that even in the 4-day work week conversation of, hey, I want to get the same salary, but in 4 days, or we're going to take a reduction of salary, or are people what's the sentiment that you've been hearing out there?
That question that we asked in this report is mostly being answered by people who don't currently have that benefit, who aren't currently working a shorter or reduced work week. We have data from people who actually participated in our pilot programs where we asked them at the end of the 6-month trial, what's that worth to you in the form of a pay increase? And the results were astounding. People saying it would take for me a 50% pay increase, a 30% pay increase. I think about 15% of people were saying that no amount of money would persuade them to go back to working 5 days, having experienced the benefits of working a 4-day work week. So I think the value of this is something that is clearly very powerful to employees. I think we know that something changed in society during and post-COVID, where a lot of people have really reevaluated their priorities, the things that matter most to them. I think that that's even more the case with Gen Z and with younger generations of employees, for whom I think that the trade-off between time and money, the pendulum for the first time in decades has started to swing more towards, time, balance, freedom, experiences than, salary increases and consumption. And that's not to say that doesn't matter. But the key point here is, lots of organizations that we worked with to implement shorter work weeks, they haven't done so, where we're saying we're going to cut your salary and reduce your hours. Because to me, if you do that, that's the trade-off. Now it's not a productivity initiative. The work that we do is about it's time for productivity, efficiency, innovation. But the reality is that we have heard from those organizations that over time, they can probably be competitive when let's say that the standard market salary increase in their industry is 4 or 5% this year. They can probably still be competitive offering people 1, 2, 3% if they're also offering something like reduced work time. And it is a question of trade-offs. If you're a not-for-profit trying to compete with the private sector, if you're a small tech company trying to compete with Meta or Google, you're not going to be able to pay top dollar. So this is a creative alternative way to really, really set yourself apart from the competition when we're still at the early adapter stage of this. And we see in the report, this is relevant to the conversation about remote work too. We ask people a very binary choice. If you could choose between 4 days in the office fully or 5 days working remotely fully, which would you choose? 59% of people, so 3 and 5, chose 4 days in the office. And I've seen a version of that statistic multiple times. And every time I see it, it really, even I can't believe it, because we've had so much conversation about how much employees are prepared to fight for remote work. I think that sends a very clear message to those leaders who are either in an industry, of which there are many, where it isn't possible to offer, very favorable work from home or remote work policies, or for whatever reason, they don't want to offer those. And we can get into whether we agree with them or not. This is you don't need to offer fully remote working and a 4-day work week and be the market leader in salary in your industry. But you probably need to be doing at least one of those things really well, or two of them pretty well, if you want to be competitive.
It's a competitive labor market, and it's only going to get more and more competitive. I mean, my unresearched opinion on that is 2025. I think we're going to see a significant shift in the market where AI, we started talking about it kind of in larger conversations kind of mid-year of 2024, and look where we are now in terms of leveraging the use of AI technology, and where's it going to go? And which I think will make some jobs even more and more competitive. And so if you're a small, medium business who, like you said, Joe, can't compete with salary on the big companies and can't compete with all those perks and benefits, or, I use that in quotations, what's your differentiator? And my philosophy whenever I've led a team is we're going to set goals, that tie to the corporate goals. So the CEO or whoever I report to needs to buy into the goals for my teams for the year and for the quarter. We operated often on a quarterly basis, and I bring that to my team. And I've said, if you get these goals done in a shorter period of time, that's awesome. I'll see you on Monday. But doesn't mean we're going to keep adding more and more and more, which is a different mindset. It's if you get your goal done halfway through the quarter, I'm not saying go on vacation for half a quarter, but it doesn't mean I'm now going to pile on extra and extra and extra. What that might highlight is that we've got a broken system.
Right. And it is about that shift towards really focusing on outcomes and results over inputs and activities. And I think that's core to a lot of the conversations we're having about work right now. I'm sick of talking about the office, being honest. I'm sick of talking about the office for, going on 5 years now. And I think it is such a distraction from the important conversations we need to be having about, not just how long should we be working for in an age where AI is accelerating down the tracks at a rate of knots. And also, how do we need to be working differently in a post-COVID, post-generative AI age? And I just think the office in many ways is just such a huge distraction from those critical debates that need to be happening. I think there's a huge crossover between the AI conversation and the conversation we're having about work time reduction in multiple ways. One, every organization I've worked with over the last 6 years has in some way used technology to augment their shorter work week. They've used it to streamline administrative processes, automate certain tasks. Obviously, the scope and the potential for that has exponentially increased just in the last 12 months. And that trend is only going to continue into the future. Secondly, similar to what we were talking about earlier, we know that leaders are struggling to get enthusiastic engagement from their employees to integrating and adopting these new tools and technologies. And a lot of that is based on fear and doom and gloom and skepticism and negativity in this sense of, is this going to make my job redundant? So much of the so there's a real opportunity to flip this on its head, make it a win-win. If AI can deliver us 8 hours worth of efficiency gains, can we reinvest 4 hours of that into new projects and initiatives and give back 4 hours to our workforce? I mean, these are the conversations that we absolutely need to be happening, because big picture here, look at what we're seeing all over the world, MAGA, Brexit, far-right movements in Europe. A lot of this is down to people feeling left behind by the last major advancement in technology, digitalization, globalization. If we aren't having a serious conversation about how we're going to share the benefits of the predicted productivity gains of artificial intelligence with the workforce, we are walking ourselves into a major, major crisis, in my opinion. And I think work time reduction is a really important part of that conversation.
So the big question is, how do we bring this conversation? I'm all in. Joe, you've convinced me. I'm in. Somebody's listening to this going like, yes, I'm in. how do I bring this conversation? Well, first off, how do I bring this conversation to the leadership team if I'm not on that leadership team? And two is maybe they're bought in and going, now what? Aside from bringing you in and saying, hey, we're going to bring in work time reduction and bring in your research and consultancy into the organization. What are a couple practical things that an organization can do? Where can we start?
So let's start at that individual employee level. And this is actually very fresh in my mind. And this is kind of a quasi plug here, but I'm writing a book, Do More in 4, which is being published by Harvard Business Review, coming out just under a year. And we have a full chapter on individual employees or groups of employees. How can you start this conversation with your boss or with your manager or with your leadership team? I think a lot of this is about, coming to the table with, number one, comfort with this being conditional. And what I mean by that is recognizing that for any leadership group to embrace piloting a shorter work week in a world where we know that that isn't the norm, where most of their clients, most of their competitors, most of their stakeholders are going to be working 5 days or going to be working, a regular work week, then that requires being prepared for the fact that this is going to need to be measured and this is going to need to be demonstrated to be successful and sustainable from the business perspective. So coming to the conversation from that perspective, coming with ideas, coming with solutions for opportunities that you believe could be exploited in order to find the capacity to make this work. I think all of those things are really critical if you want to, you need to be looking at this as, a business case. This is not, a concession that you're seeking the organization to give. This is an incentive that you're saying that, as a group of employees, you believe that you want the opportunity to at least try, and that you believe fundamentally that you can achieve.
Yeah, I think it's bringing that business case, but also just trying, looking even at your own job and thinking about, okay, what could you potentially outsource to AI? Maybe your company doesn't have an AI policy, so, use caution on that. But what are elements of the organization that could be outsourced to an AI agent to free up that creativity time? And I have found, even for myself, if I'm just in heads down, I just got to do work, it's draining. But when I have the freedom to be creative, whether it's even creative writing a policy, in the HR work I'm doing, researching what other companies do and how, what we could adapt to the organizations that I'm supporting, and giving that creative freedom. And it also brings about that, as you said at the beginning, that enthusiastic buy-in and engagement. And it's not like, oh, you saved 10% of your time by outsourcing or by streamlining a system. It doesn't mean, oh, I now need to take on something else. It's like, hey, maybe I can take off half day Fridays. And, I think there's still that mindset shift that has to happen. And from that place of pessimistic view, that pessimism of like, oh, this is going to just pour on more onto my plate, to like, hey, if we can reduce our work time, what does it look like? Because, for me, flexibility is incredibly important. Having that flexibility to have breakfast with my kids or pick them up from school from time to time, or, taking off early to go camping or hiking on the weekends and things like that. So, from an HR perspective, there's a lot that often will fall on an HR person. CEO might be listening to this, or they look at your work and they go, hey, HR, go and figure this out. What can we do? For an HR person, what advice would you have for them specifically?
I think that the key thing initially is committing to the exploration, the feasibility study, putting in place the framework, but this is not something that can be solved around the executive table. You need to come up with all of the ideas and all of the solutions before you engage your team and before you start. Because honestly, even if you come up with a reorganization of new policies, new processes, if we do X, Y, and Z, this is what's going to create the efficiency that we need to make this work, it isn't going to stick. It might work in the first instance, but it isn't going to stick. And the reason it won't stick is because your people don't own it. This has to be a bottom-up process. We are talking about forming new work habits and then sustaining them. And if people aren't kind of left with the tools and empowered to actually say at an individual level, at a team level, what are the things that you need to change in order to make this a success? It isn't something you're going to be. That's one of the biggest fears that CEOs have is, I can see how we might achieve the initial productivity uplift, but how do we stop that from waning over time? And the way that you stop that from waning over time is that you embed this as a continuous improvement initiative that is owned by employees. This is something where most organizations we work with, they're not executing this necessarily as a kind of a permanent contractual change. They're implementing this as a policy, which is continuously reviewed, and where people feel like we need to earn this incredible benefit. And it creates this remarkable positive tension within teams where, just as you described, the benefit of this is so personal. That's what makes it work. You run a yoga class at lunchtime, everyone's going to have a different experience of that. You give people back their Friday afternoons. To me, it might mean spending more time with my elderly relative. To you, it might mean, spending more time on a hobby that you love. To someone else, it might be learning a new language that you've been putting off for years. So the benefit is so personal. If you've got people who are slacking off and who are coasting within teams, you create this incredible team-based collective accountability where there is an expectation where you're managing sideways, where, hey, hang on a minute, we all need to be pulling together if we want to be able to continue to make this work. That's what this is really about.
Yeah, it's getting that right from the ground level all the way up. If you're looking at a hierarchical structure, is getting that enthusiasm. I mean, you've said it right at the beginning, that buy-in and that enthusiasm, and saying, hey, like, we're going to work hard. We're going to find those efficiencies. We need to reduce that noise. What can we automate? What systems can we implement in order to reduce these manual tasks? In order to create that, whatever it is, a shorter work day, shorter work week. I love that 4 days in the office and one, extended weekend, or, whatever that looks like to your organization. The data is clear based on, the data that's already there, plus the great data that's in this new report, which shows people want it, whether your organization is going to embrace it or not. So just, if you're listening to this, just think about this. You're employing maybe one person, 100 people, 1,000 people. The data shows that they want this. They will forego salary just to take this. So if somebody on your team's a high performer and they get a job offer, and that job offer is like, you know what? Yeah, we work on goals. We don't work on time, and we're going to pay you X salary. That's a real threat to your organization.
I would say to any leader that's listening to this, Tim, don't just take our word for it. Christopher Pissarides, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist from the UK, he made headlines last year for predicting that a 4-day work week is coming in the very near future as a result of AI, similar to people like Bill Gates and Jamie Dimon and others. But that's not why I'm bringing him up. The reason I'm bringing him up is that he won his Nobel Prize for demonstrating that search theory, which is this idea that businesses will create new products and create new services based on what consumers are demanding in the market, that also applies to the employment market. In other words, over time, in a free market economy, businesses will end up developing perks, benefits, and offerings for employees in response to what they're demanding. I think the data is so clear on this that over and above pretty much anything else, and we could cite so many other studies beyond just this one, consistently, 4-day work weeks, flexible working, work-life balance. These are the things that are coming in ahead of salary and ahead of remote work. KPMG did a study on this, Deloitte, Bank of America. These are consistently, top 1, top 2, top 3. So if Christopher Pissarides is right, and who are we to argue with a Nobel Prize winning economist, this is coming down the tracks. And really the choice that people face is, do we want to be planning for this? Do we want to be thinking about this? Do we want to be activating this now? Or do we want to be following one of our big competitors who got out ahead of us and did it first? Because I think the biggest benefits of this are going to flow to the organizations that are the early movers.
So good. I'm so eager to see where this idea, this not even an idea anymore, this movement of measuring just productivity rather than time in a seat. I could show up and sit in an office for 8 hours, and I can look busy. doesn't mean I'm busy, and leave, versus here's your clear goal. Here's how we're going to hold you accountable. Here's the measures we're going to put in place. Do you agree to those? Yes. Let's go and get to work. And that's where the market is going and needs to go. Joe, I'm excited for this report to come out. For those who are listening, you need to make sure that you are subscribed at flexos.work/subscribe to make sure you know when this episode or other episodes are coming out, but also subscribe to the newsletters, because that's where you're going to get the report. And Joe, if people are interested, I'm sure you've piqued the interest of some people who are listening to this. Where can they find you? Where can they reach you?
Our website is worktimereduction.com. I'm on LinkedIn. The organization is on LinkedIn. Those are good places to find us. I used to be a frequent Twitter X user, but not so much recently. I've joined Blue Sky, but haven't really got going with it yet. So I would say website, LinkedIn, probably your best places.
Sounds good. And we'll make sure all those links are in the show notes as well. And for those who are listening, we appreciate you. We appreciate all the comments we get, the feedback we get from these episodes. As I mentioned before, head to the website, flexos.work/subscribe to subscribe to this podcast, to subscribe to our network of podcasts, but also don't stop there. We have a number of newsletters that really focus on the future of work, AI, and where is this future of work going to be taking us? And so make sure you subscribe to our newsletter, and you have a choice to subscribe to a number of different newsletters there. Subscribe to them all. They're all great. And so with that, thanks everyone for tuning in, and thank you, Joe, for coming on.
Thanks, Tim. Pleasure.